thinking about Spanish national culture, I hope you can all hear us. So when one thinks about Spain, a few things tend to come to mind, like flamenco, paella, bullfighting, and sangria. Though these symbols are commonly associated with Spain by outsiders, citizens do not always identify with them, in particular due to the growing Basque and Catalan independence movements. This talk will analyse the cultural and political stakes of the branding of Spain at local, regional, and national levels.
Professor Duncan Wheeler is the Chair of Spanish Studies at the University of Leeds. He is the Hispanic Studies Editor of Modern Language Review. His latest book is called Following Franco, Spanish Culture and Politics in Transition. Professor Wheeler is often asked for his perspective on Spanish culture and politics by media outlets such as the BBC, The Guardian, The Economist, El País, The Times Literary Supplement, and the London Review of Books. Today, he has been kind enough to give us an overview of some of the issues covered in his book.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I would have very much liked to have been there in person. Unfortunately, that isn't the way that we're things are allowed to work at the moment. And I've just had a slight problem. Oh no, here we are with the PowerPoint. But I'm very jealous of you all actually, well, those of you who are actually sitting in classrooms. I'm sitting here in my office. As my plan is to talk for about 40 minutes. I'm going to talk in English, but as you go along, if you have any questions or you know, you can put them in the Q&A function, and please feel free to ask for questions in Spanish, English, maybe even Catalan. Can't really do Basque, I'm afraid, but whatever you feel most comfortable with. And what I'm going to be doing today is just covering a kind of a series of broader issues about what, you know, what do we mean when we talk about Spain, when we talk about Spanish nation, when we talk about Spanish culture. And I've just put up on the first slide, which hopefully everyone can see, two images of Spain. One of which is the Spanish flag, which I'll return to, and the other is perhaps a typical, what we might consider to be a typical image of Spain, a bull. When people think about Spain, they often think about bulls, flamenco, etc. Now that sort of images are often dismissed or referred to as, you know, tourist-friendly, stereotypes. Maybe the word in Spanish is tópico. Tópico means cliche. But what I want to suggest is that even if we do think, you know, that Spain is a much more richer and pluralistic nation, entity, people than such symbols, now like simplistic and reductive symbols might suggest, but even taking that on board, actually thinking about these symbols and thinking about the way in which they've been used can tell us something, I think, about the history of Spain. So I think you know, and I think when we talk about kind of flamenco, bullfighting or whatever, I mean, I remember always, you know, I think when I first started studying Spanish, I assumed that everybody at the weekends went and danced flamenco, went to bullfights. And it's very much similar to the idea of, you know, people in Spain might think of us, but we all have tea at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, or that we, you know, I don't quite know how they think this when so many come to England, that we all have tailors or something. There's these kind of set images of countries which are just in, you know, in the international imaginary. So a little bit about me. Let me just move, sorry, onto the second slide. As very kindly said in the introduction, I'm an academic based at the University of Leeds. And I've just published this book called Following Franco, Spanish Culture and Politics in Transition. And what I'm doing today is kind of, you know, doing a sort of 40-minute, taking some of the issues I discussed there and putting them in this discussion forum so we can all have a think about it. Now, one of the things I wanted to say about this book is, or not actually about the book, but about the topic, is that it's taken me, one of the advantages of being an academic over being a student is that you can get unlimited numbers of extensions, or you can ask for them at least. So this book's actually taken me 10 years to write, which it wasn't intended to take that long. My publishers had huge amount of patience with me. Now you might ask me, why is that? Has it been procrastination, laziness? Probably both those come into play, but actually it's because I think the topic of what I was exploring has become much more complex over the last 10 years. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is I set off to write a book which was going to cover how Spain went from being a dictatorship under General Franco, which began in 1960. Sorry, beginning my study in 1962 and taking it to 1992. So a 30-year period of looking at how Spain went from being a kind of backwater in Europe to being a modern European state. One of the things that has made the book much more complicated to write, and has made why it's delayed me, is that when I started off writing the book, I very much saw it as being a book about the past, about talking about what happened in that 30-year period. But as so often happens, what happens in the past has an effect on what happens in the present. And actually, one of the major events of what's happened in Spain over the last 10 years really feed back to a lot, or really can be easily related back to what happened in this 30-year period. Just to give you some examples of that. One we could talk about is, you may have seen that the emeritus king, Juan Carlos, who was very much seen as the hero of the transition, has gone into exile, has left Spain amidst scandals about him hunting for elephants and his fraudulent practices and multiple lovers. You may have seen, it was often seen that after Franco, the image that we have here as the front cover of this book is actually from a fascist rally in 1977. But it was often thought that Franco died in 1975, but it was thought, after him, fascism on the far right just disappeared in Spain, which it did for many years. But there's been a resurgence in recent years with the party Vox, which some of you may have looked at in your classes, who are using a far right narrative or rhetoric, which hasn't been in evidence in Spain since the Franco period. Another thing we could talk about, another major issue in Spain, has been the Catalan independence referendum, declared anti-constitutional by the central state. That has arguably got its origins in the pacts which were made to enable Spain to become a democracy, and I'll explain that as I go along. You may have seen, those of you who are more astute, you'll have seen that I put in the original title, it made a reference to Spanish national cultures. And the reason I put it in plural rather than singular is because I think that there's not one Spain, but there's multiple Spains. And they're often understanding these different complex and sometimes contradictory Spains can give us a richer understanding than we'd find from just tourist postcards. So that's a kind of long preamble from me. But I wanted to go back and just provide a little bit of history. And I apologize for those of you who this may be very obvious to, but I thought it was best to kind of begin with this sort of almost Wikipedia style exposition, just to make sure that nobody gets lost. So what happens is that in 1936, there is an illegal coup, an anti-democratic coup against the Spanish Second Republic. That is led by, General Francisco Franco. The Spanish Civil War, which takes place from 1936 to 1939, is seen by many in the rest of the world as being a fight against fascism, against democracy. It's seen almost as a dress rehearsal for the Second World War. So Franco's victory in the Spanish Civil War leads to his dictatorship from 1939 to 1975. I just want to, and he fought, one of his slogans of the Francoists was España, una grande y libre. I'm sorry, I've just realized there's a missing comma in that. What does that mean? It means Spain, one great, unified, great and free. And one of the things that Franco fought, or the people who supported Franco fought, was they thought that Spain was descending into chaos. And one of the reasons they thought it was descending into chaos was they thought that the Basques, the Catalans, were wanting to have too much independence, were wanting to break away from its national project. And they thought the only logical conclusion to that would be just anarchy and violence. And they thought that they had to rescue Spain from these dangerous images, of dangerous forces. And you'll sometimes see that's why the Francoists often referred to themselves as los nacionales or los nacionalistas. So they saw themselves as both protecting the nation and being nationalist in preserving that nation. So that was what led to the Franco dictatorship from 1939 to 1975. How did the the Franco dictatorship come to an end? Was he overthrown? Was there a revolution? No. Franco simply died in his bed. And if you think about the other Europe, that's unusual for dictators, because when you think, most dictators get overthrown at some, or a high percentage get overthrown at some point. And I think one of the uncomfortable truths of modern Spanish history, and I don't want to how did Franco retain his power? Well, one of the ways was direct repression. There was lots of murders, there was lots of torture, etc. But I think sometimes it gets forgotten, but there was a percentage of the population who actively supported him, and a much larger percentage of the population who accepted him. And I think, why did they accept him? Well, I think one of the reasons was that Spain was getting richer, standards of living were going up, and also the fear of going back to a civil war. The civil war was hugely traumatic. And people thought, well, there was often a slogan of Franco brought peace, paz y pan, brought peace and bread, allow people to eat. I don't agree with that narrative, but that narrative is there. And so we then got the thing about often, and this was one of the things I wanted to cover in the book, was it's often seemed, you think Franco dies, dictatorship ends, democracy begins. It was nowhere near that simple. We have to understand the transition as a long progress. And my central argument, and I don't know, I know some of you for your A-levels will be studying the Civil War, some might be studying the transition period itself, the 1980s, but one of my central theses is the fact that you cannot understand what happened in the 1970s without understanding what happened in the Civil War, and you cannot understand what's happening now in Spain without understanding what happened in the 1970s. So, what did happen in the 1970s? Well, there's a huge dilemma, because what you have is we got an image, the photo you can see here is of General Franco with his chosen heir, King Juan Carlos. You think, where do rulers get their legitimacy from? What gave Franco his right to rule? Well, arguably he had no genuine legitimacy. His legitimacy came from force. It came from winning a civil war, which again was begun with an illegal coup. Juan Carlos's case is slightly different, because Juan Carlos's case is that his legitimacy comes from two sources. One, his royal lineage, so he's a member of the royal family, Spanish royal family, who'd repeatedly gone into exile. That's a whole other story. And the second is the fact that he was Franco's chosen heir. So that means that the king of democratic Spain is to a large extent king because he's a chosen successor of a dictator. That creates a very unusual panorama. And for some people, the fact that the monarchy was born out of a dictatorship is proof of the transition being a somewhat bogus transition, it being something of a sham. And actually, if you notice the title of my book, Following Franco, it's deliberately ambiguous, because following can mean what literally comes after Franco, or it can mean, was this a democracy, a democratic regime formed in the image of at least some elements of Francoism? They're big questions. I think they're the kind of questions you could spend 10 years like me researching, but just so you have an idea of where my framework is. And I'm not going to, because for purposes of time, I'm not going to show the clips in this presentation, but they are there if anyone wants to look after them. What you will see is an image on that YouTube clip of the Prime Minister of the time announcing to the nation that Franco was died, and he's in tears. And often what happens is that we're often told that, you know, everyone was upset, everyone was popping champagne the day Franco died. Some people were, but equally the mass majority of people were just scared. They were thinking, what's going to happen now? You know, they were scared of a return of a civil war, of losing their standard of living, etc. And Juan Carlos, what he did, what his mission was to try and bring a very divided nation, both geographically, politically, generationally, all on side into a common project. How did he do that? Or what were the challenges there? Well, his challenge was the fact that people didn't, you know, he had to have a kind of common project for the state, for Spain. But actually, Spain, as I say, is made up of many different realities. And this is a quote going back from 1943 from Gerald Brennan, a British traveller there. And he says, quote, Spain is the land of the Patria Chica. Every village, every town is the center of an intense social and political life. As in classical times, a man's allegiance is first of all to his native place or to his family or social group in it, and only secondly to his country and government. And I think actually there's a lot going on in that quote, but one of the things to think is that perhaps one of the reasons that Franco was so aggressively nationalist, so aggressively kind of saying, you know, we need to, you know, Spanish flags everywhere, was that the Spanish nation state had traditionally been weak. So Juan Carlos has a huge challenge in kind of bringing these people, you know, people from these multiple different realities on board in a common project. And sorry, I should have, I'll come back to this actually, sorry. And the biggest threat to the transition as a project is the aspirations of Catalan and Basque independentists. Because these were people who really were actually often quite violently against and quite viscerally against the Spanish, about the idea of a Spanish national project. Juan Carlos had to somehow keep them happy, but equally, and so did the, you know, so did also, but equally he couldn't give them too much leeway. He couldn't give too much to their demands, because if so, the army would possibly have intervened in another coup. So it was a real balancing act. Whether that was a successful balancing act is a different matter. So that's the kind of big political framework. But let's think about this idea of the kind of, you know, the diversity in Spain in terms of culture. Well, in terms of both climate, customs, ways of being, ways of living, Spain is made up of very different realities. For those of you who have, people are always surprised, for example, if they go to the Basque country in November, but you often see British people will go there and they won't take a coat, because when they think of Spain, what do they think? It's sunny and hot. Well, it is in Andalusia for most of the year, but not in northern Spain. The kind of food that people eat is very different. You know, people always say they want to go to a Spanish tapas restaurant. Tapas is a reality in Andalusia and certain other regions, but not everywhere. And the challenge for all kind of political regimes, be they dictatorships, be they democracies in Spain, has often been to balance this kind of diversity with some sense of unity. How did Francoism do that? Well, Francoism did that largely by the exploitation of folkloric images. So it kind of, what it did was it said, okay, you know, every city, every area has got its own things unique to it, but that all formed part of the rich tapestry of what's Spain. And it made them into kind of, you know, light-hearted, fun images. So here we've got some images from the 60s, a period of growth in tourism, of flamenco, of bullfighting, etc. And it's this idea of it being folkloric spectacle. There was a tourist phrase, Spain is different, which actually means two different things. It means on the one hand, Spain is kind of different to dry, boring England, Northern Europe, but it also means there's lots of different things to discover in Spain. You know, you can go to this, but you can eat gazpacho in this place. You can eat, if you go to this place, then you can have chiparones. But all of this is grounded within a kind of reality of a common, this España una grande y libre. And most of the symbols of what, the kind of stereotypical images of Spain are often those which are associated with that one particular region of Andalusia. Why is that? Well, one is the reason is that Andalusia was always a popular tourist destination. The other, I think, is that it wasn't as fiercely an independent, there wasn't so many, although there was some claims to nationalism there, it wasn't a region of Spain which was seeking independence in the way that Catalonia and the Basque Country were. So I've referred to, if let's go to what we might call the more problematic, from the point of view of Spanish national culture, the more problematic autonomous communities within Spain, we have Galicia, Catalonia, and the Basque Country. Here you've got some images of some culture from these different areas. And why do I call them the three historical nationalities? I call them that because during the Second Republic, that period just before the Second World War, there'd been a series of devolution to these regions from a central government. So much as say what's happened in Scotland in recent years in the UK, that sort of process of devolution and greater autonomous powers was happening in Spain in the 1930s. And the Francoists thought this was just too much, and that, if this carried on, Spain would cease to exist as an entity. And what you can see is, I think, with these different customs, there's always a very narrow line between when are the kind of customs we have here, the bagpipes of Galicia, which always had the weakest nationalist movement of the three historical nationalities. This, I think, these sort of bagpipes, this sort of traditional music can be made into as part of the kind of Spanish, it's be seen as part of this Spain is different folklorization. It's not seriously about looking for, that much independence. But actually, if we come to the second image of the Catalan castells, which are human towers, or the third, the Basque game of pelota, which is a kind of aggressive form of squash, I think in these cases, these become more problematic for the Spanish state, because they're often seen as representing something about the Catalan and the Basque people as being distinct from the Spanish. So the castells is talking about this form of community building, which often Catalan nationalists seem to feel is antithetical to the Spanish nationalists. The Basque is about, a kind of sense of heritage and strength, which is seen as being unique to the Basques. And I think one of the most frequent claims that I've come across, and you may have read it in books, when I came across when people talk about the Catalan situation within Spain, is the fact it's often said Catalan was banned under Franco. That's not strictly true. Actually, something far more damaging, I think, happened to Catalan than it being banned. Catalan was patronized. So as in, it was seen as a kind of secondary, almost hillbilly language. And often you'd have, and just because the Francoists were somewhat embarrassed by the fact that actually, arguably, the Catalan culture, Barcelona as opposed to Madrid is literally at the center of Spain, was the cultural capital of the Spanish state in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and many other decades. And I've put here, was Catalan banned during the regime of Pani Toros? I put Pani Toros because that's that kind of regime of kind of folkloric, exuberant fun. And actually, some of the most, I've got here images of two artists, Catalan artists from the 1960s. One is Joan Manuel Serrat, a singer-songwriter, and the other is Juan Marcé. In my view, my favorite novelist in the Spanish language, in the Castilian language. He wrote in Spanish as opposed to Catalan. He recently died. But there was, for example, literary prizes in Catalan, even under Francoism, which is something the Catalan nationalists often tell you wasn't the case, but actually it was. But the key thing was that when you applied for those prizes, you had to do the covering letter in Catalan, sorry, in Castilian, in Spanish. What's that signifying? It's signifying that, okay, this is almost a kind of, niche thing. You can't have, you can't, it's not an official language. You couldn't fill in official documents in Catalan. And actually, to illustrate this point, I'd like to refer to what might seem to us now a rather almost comic case. which is the case of Joan Manuel Serrat being entered into the Eurovision Song Contest in 1968. The Eurovision Song Contest was taken phenomenally seriously in Spain at the time, because at a time when it hadn't been allowed to join the European Economic Union, it was seen as being a gateway into being accepted in Europe. So Joan Manuel Serrat was picked, and he said, once he'd been picked, he said, I want to represent Spain. He said, Spain is a multilingual reality. There's multiple languages in Spain. There's Castilian, there's Catalan, there's Galician. And as a Catalan, I want to be able to represent my country by singing in Catalan, because that's where I'm from. And the Spanish state not only said no to that, but actually vetoed, when he pulled out because they'd said no, he became a persona non grata and had to go into exile in Latin America. Actually turned out very well for him, because he became a superstar in Latin America, where it's that actually enabled him to become a multimillionaire, but that's a whole other story. And I've just put, again, another link that you can look at later on in your time if you want to, if you would like to, is the story of how actually of the Eurovision Song Contest, which actually Spain then went on to win when another singer came and sang it in Castilian Spanish. And there's been rumours that the Spanish state actually used bribes to secure a victory for Maciel over poor Cliff Richard, but that's a whole other story. So the point I wanted to make was, Catalan was not banned, but it was patronised, and this was always going to be a challenge when it came to Franco's death, or the aftermath of Franco's death, because what would happen when, the kind of quite reasonably, the Catalan people involved in the Catalan cultural sphere would say, we want more rights, we want our culture to be recognised as being equal, maybe even better to Spanish national culture. And I think another complicated dimension here is kind of, because you're the enemy of your enemy is your friend kind of logic. Because Franco had been so centralist, had been so, keen to not allow Basque Catalan culture to flourish, very much the flourishing of culture from these different parts of Spain with very different traditions and cultures was very much seen to be part of, the democratization process. So you've got this very strange situation where it's associated with democratization, but actually, because of a tightrope of a transition, Basque and Catalan nationalist claims could in fact be seen to derail democratization, because there was always the fear that they'd provoke the army into having another coup. Democracy wasn't that simple, because the armies, many of whom had still, had memories of a civil war, were the ones with the arms. They had guns. They could take to the streets again. And I want to here make a distinction between different forms of nationalism. It's too slightly simplistic the way I put it up here, but I think it's a gateway into us discussing this. Cultural versus violent nationalism. And here I've got two images by two of the leading painters, Spanish painters, which you may recognize. The first one is of Pablo Picasso's Guernica. What is this painting? One of the most famous paintings of the 20th century, if not the most famous. This is an image done by the Pablo Picasso, born in Malaga, great bullfighting fan, would often go there, but also, he didn't want, he relished in some forms of what I've described as folklore, but equally he wanted to be connected to major artistic currents. He went to Barcelona and then to Paris, but this was a painting done about the aerial bombing of a Basque town during the Civil War. The idea of this painting was to provoke indignation at what was happening in Spain, to try and make other countries intervene to save democracy in Spain. That attempt was unsuccessful as a propaganda exercise, but the painting survived, and as I say, is perhaps certainly the most famous Spanish painting of the 20th century, and arguably the most famous painting from any country. It was put up in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and Picasso had always said this painting could not return to Spain until there was democracy. So this is an image of violence, of seeing the tension between the centre and the regions of one of violence, but with hope that might not always be the case. And actually the return of the painting was seen as a triumph for democracy. The other is by the artist resident in Barcelona, the Catalan artist Joan Miró. This is an image he did for a modern art image of a tourist campaign for tourism in Spain, but it's a very different image to those folkloric images we saw before. And it's a kind of image of a trade-off. It was, Joan Miró sort of saying, I will advertise the Spanish national project, but using art forms, modern art forms, which really have their strongest roots in Catalonia. And actually what you find in these years of transition is that a model of accommodation, of agreement, of compromise was generally found between Catalan nationalists and the state. And that was largely because their demands had to do with having their language, their customs, their culture recognized. That was what they wanted. They weren't necessarily wanting to be independent, or only minimal numbers of people wanted independence. This was very different to the case of the Basque country. In the Basque country, it was similar to, say, the situation with the IRA or certain parallels. It wasn't necessarily similar in all respects in the UK. There was an idea of many Basque nationalists said, no, we do not recognize the Spanish state, be that a Francoist Spanish state or be that a Spanish state under Juan Carlos. And the Basque country was the only area of Spain where the Spanish Democratic Constitution of 1978 didn't receive, in a referendum on that, more people voted against it than for it. So we then have, I want to focus a little bit on Basque culture, on Basque politics and Basque culture. Because we have this group which you may have heard of called ETA. So ETA are is the sort of the equivalent, and there's always been this question of I put revolutionaries and or cold-blooded killers. Because what were ETA? ETA were an organization which in the late years of Franco used violent means to try and destabilize the Francoist state. They were, for many members of ETA, it was a huge disappointment that Franco died in his bed. They would have liked the regime to be toppled. And in the 1960s and 1970s, many people, both within and outside Spain, who were pro-democracy, actually had sympathies for ETA. Because they thought they might be using violent means, but as a dictatorial regime where torture is still used, the death penalty is still there, perhaps the end justified the means. However, when they continued killing within the democratic period, public sympathy their actions became far less justified or justifiable, and public opinion turned against them. And I have two images here. The one amongst the rubble is of from 1973, and is where ETA or people from ETA blew up the Prime Minister's car. They assassinated the Prime Minister. Now, one of the very uncomfortable truths about Spain's transition to democracy, and this isn't a truth which is discussed that much in Spain, certainly not in Spanish schools, is the fact that Prime Minister was a very strong, horrible man in many ways, but he was a skilled politician and very strong. If he had not been assassinated, perhaps Francoism could have outlived the death of Franco. So in some senses, perhaps Spanish democracy owes some form of debt to ETA. As I say, that's an uncomfortable truth and a controversial one, but it's something that I think needs to be discussed, even though it's not necessarily accepted. The other image on the side is from the 1990s, is when ETA kidnapped a young councillor from the right-wing PP party, and when their demands weren't met, killed him. Assassinated him in cold blood. And that was, I think, really where any last vestiges of public sympathy went from ETA. So from a transition period, the 1970s, it appears that Basque nationalism is much more controversial than Catalan nationalism, or much more destabilizing. Why then has that changed in recent years? Because in recent years, it seems that the big issue with the big threat to the Spanish national project appears to come from Catalonia and not the Basque country. Well, another topic which we could spend hours talking about, but just to kind of simplify, I would say what's happened is there's been various reasons why Basque nationalism has abated, or the kind of, sorry, I shouldn't say Basque nationalism, I should say the violent Basque nationalism of ETA. One of which is the fact that, the loss of public sympathy in ETA. One is that actually the Basque Country is one of the richest areas of Spain, and it manages to, with its own rights to collect tax. And that means it's been able to weather the financial post-2008 financial crisis better than other regions of Spain. But actually, the Catalan case has been almost the opposite, because there's been a sense in recent years that especially the Spanish central government has been very intransigent in especially the PP, the right-wing PP, and hasn't, recognised. It's continued to, there's a sense in which it's continued to patronise Catalan and Catalans in the way that perhaps the Franco state did, or certain echoes of this. There's a sense, because Catalonia is rich in relative terms with the other region of Spain, there's been a sense that people there increasingly feel they're subsidising an inefficient Spanish state. I think I'd also say that Catalan nationalism has offered a selective history, so that people feel in Catalonia often, or certain sections of Catalan society feel that they're victims, they've been victimised. I think that's I call it selective, because they often don't mention the fact, as I say, in the 70s, most of the Catalan population was behind the transition project. The kind of, many in the civil war, some Catalan industrialists supported the the Francoists. And increasingly, there's been a rejection in Catalan culture has always, as we've seen, been distinct in many ways to Spanish culture, but in recent years there's been an increased rejection of Spanish culture. So, for example, bullfighting was banned in 2011 in Catalonia. I think in certain senses, that's not against that ban. I'd say, fair enough if for animal cruelty, maybe it shouldn't be done. But actually what I found slightly problematic about it was they banned official bullfights, but not actually festivities taking place in villages, which often involved great violence to bulls, but these were seen as Catalan traditions. And I think that banning of bullfighting needs to be seen very much more of a rejection of Spanish national culture than it does a protection of animal rights. And this raises another issue, which is, how do we actually define Catalan culture? Do we define it as culture with the origins in Catalonia, or culture made and consumed by those living in Catalonia? If the latter, maybe bullfighting could be included in it, because because Catalonia was the most industrial powerhouse of Spain, in the 50s and 60s, many people there was many economic migrants who moved from Andalusia, other parts of Galicia, from other parts of Spain, and took their traditions with them. Is the culture they consume, if they have been in Catalonia for 50 years, can that be considered Catalan culture or not? For a die-hard Catalan nationalist, they'd say no, because they'd say if you allow Spanish national culture to infiltrate, it will take over, and these specific things, which are specific to Catalan, will get kind of drowned out. And just as a kind of, I think one of the major things that allowed actually the transition to take place was that many Spaniards across the political board, across the different regions, got behind a project of Spain becoming part of the EU, becoming modernized. That kind of shared project allowed certain differences to be put to one side for a period. Paradoxically, however, actually that project allowed the kind of rise of Catalan nationalism, because there's lots of the wealth in Catalonia often comes from industry. And previously, Catalonia was more dependent on the rest of Spain to export its goods to. But now it's part of the EU. There's a feeling in which it can actually buy, some people say, well, why doesn't it just bypass the Spanish state and export directly to other richer territories? Now, I've covered an awful lot of ground there, possibly too quickly, but I wanted to, the reason I wanted to do that was so that people could then in the questions and answers pick up on those areas which you might be studying in class that might be of personal interest. And I hope as a kind of, beyond the kind of the major political cultural points I've made about, reminding you again the idea that the transitions is important for understanding Spain today as the Civil War was for understanding the transition. I hope I've at least hinted at that there's a lot more to Spanish culture, cuisine than paella and flamenco. Thank you very much for your attention, everybody. I don't know if anybody...
Thank you so much. Sorry.
Thank you.
So thank you so much. So we have a few questions from the Q&A. So first, what do you think about the recent movement of independence for Catalonia, and what specific ideas do you agree with from both sides?
Right. That's another question I could talk for hours on. I mean, I think the problem, it's a huge, what I can understand from a Catalan perspective, I can understand the huge frustration at the unwillingness of the central government to dialogue. That I can understand completely. What I find more problematic, as I say, is the sense of selective use of history. And I think also I'm not blaming the Catalan nationalists for this, but I think it's had some very unfortunate effects. So just to give one example, Carles Puigdemont, who was the kind of as a leader, the ringleader behind the referendum. When he came to the Oxford Union, and when he was speaking there, he said, it's us, we're the bulwark against extreme nationalism in Spain. We're the bulwark against, we're Catalan nationalists, but if it wasn't for us, then parties like Vox, the far right ones, might be winning more votes. I'd say that's completely not true, because what has happened is that actually part of the extreme right, Vox, has been able to return largely because they've been seen to take a firm hand against Catalan nationalists against that. And what I think is, I mean, this is maybe just very utopic. I think what's needed is a kind of shared, some form of actually active dialogue about how to move this thing forward, because it's clear that, Catalan nationalism isn't going to go away, but for both Spanish voters, a large number of voters in Catalonia it was completely unacceptable, the idea of Catalonia being given some form of independence. And the European Union's made very clear that it sees it being as an internal matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Someone else is asking, do you think that ETA's motivations were justified?
Wow, that's a big question. I think I wouldn't say I don't think they were ever justified. I would say that in certain periods and contexts, they can be understood. I could see the case for them being understood as justifiable. And I think actually one of the things I would say is about ETA is that ETA is more than anything a Francoist failure. What do I mean by that? What I mean is popular support for ETA came about. It was a very small setup when it started. Popular support for ETA came about because the horrible repression by the Franco, when they were kind of wanting to arrest people, the torture people who often had nothing to do with ETA, and that actually, that intransigence actually led to the rising amount of support as an organization. And I think we've got to be careful with words like terrorism and things like that, because it's a violent, horrible thing that in some senses it's never justified. But in another sense, let's not forget that Margaret Thatcher called Nelson Mandela a terrorist, and he was involved in activities which were terrorist. But that's kind of history. The way in which it's narrativized afterwards can make it seem more or less acceptable. It's a politician's answer there, which is saying neither yes nor no.
Thank you. And why do you think that Franco didn't get involved in the Second World War after all the help he had received from Hitler and the Nazis in 1936?
Good. That's a good question. Which would be, I think there's two sides to it. I think one side is the fact that. Sorry, can you hear me? Okay, there is it. Yep. One side is the pragmatic side, and that side is that by 1939, Spain had had 3 years of war, was completely devastated. What actually could Spain have contributed? And the other thing was, so that's the kind of pragmatics. The population was tired of warfare. Then there's the pragmatic. Franco was a great pragmatist, and what Franco wanted to do was he wanted to kind of hedge his bets, and basically be in with Hitler and Mussolini in the hope that if the Axis powers, the fascist powers, won the Second World War, he'd be able to get some of the victory spoils. But equally, once it was clear the tide was turning once the tide was turning on Germany, they didn't want to be, they didn't want to be punished at the end of the Second World War. So they were kind of quite sensible, and he kind of stressing his own neutrality. Although it was very clear all the way through that Franco's preference would have been for a victory by the Nazis.
Thank you. And to what extent do you think that bilingualism in Catalonia is important for their regional identity, particularly in their education system?
I mean, I think it's hugely important. It's and that was where a lot of the efforts, if you go back to the 1970s, that was where the big efforts came. The issue with it is that the issue with bilingualism and how you teach always relates to questions of power and class, in my view. What do I mean by that? Well, one thing I mean is in the same way as we've gone from one extreme to the other, because in the 1960s or 1970s, early 1970s, speaking Catalan was seen as secondary to speaking Spanish. It was seen as teaching, it's kind of the same kind of hillbilly language. That was completely wrong. But I think there's also a danger, especially when I say there's this huge history of immigration from the rest of Spain, for people speaking in Castilian to be seen as somehow secondary, so in order for you to have a prestige job, you'd be able to have to be bilingual in Catalan. And I remember one of the things that was interesting when I did the interview with Serrat, who was that singer who wanted to sing in Catalan for the Eurovision Song Contest. I remember when I said to him, you being bilingual, he actually answered to me, he was like, I'm not actually sure I am bilingual. He said, I was raised in a bilingual family, in a bilingual context. But he's like, I'm not sure, because he lives in Madrid now. He's like, maybe I do speak Castilian Spanish a little bit better. I don't know. But I think the danger is, and the real challenge is, and linguists would have to do this, I think the ideal situation we need to get to is because if you just teach, if you allow if you have equal Castilian Catalan, the more dominant language, Castilian, will always win out. So it's trying to find ways in which Catalan's given a fighting chance, but equally the kind of power and influence isn't reserved just for those who are native of Catalonia.
Thank you. This is a sort of follow-on question from that. Until when was Catalan considered a hillbilly language, and what caused it to sort of now be considered a proper language?
Well, I think the hillbilly language comes from a kind of concerted effort by the Francoists to kind of turn anything, as I say, regional, to kind of sort of the same images we see of those flamenco dancers, kind of just seeing it as being kind of happy gypsy. It was just saying, oh, well, you've got gypsies now, you've got gypsies dancing flamenco in Andalusia, and then you've got these people in Catalonia speaking, with Catalan, which is kind of this funny, kind of almost semi-comic language. And you'd have lots in plays and films. Think about the way it's happening less now, but it was a shame, but it always used to happen. You'd often have in productions of Shakespeare in the UK kind of comic people speaking in comic Irish accents, and it was kind of it's a similar sort of thing. It's sort of saying, oh, aren't these people kind of funny with their funny little accents? They seem as harmless, but they're patronised. And I think the prestige with Catalan really comes with when the creation of the autonomous communities in 1978, when kind of matters of education, the whole different education department created, and actually with the president of Catalonia for a long period, Jordi Pujol, he pursued huge amount, both, and he was very good or very skilled at combining both high and low culture. So he did things like he had TV, he had Dallas, which was a soap opera in the 80s, dubbed into Catalan. EastEnders has appeared in Catalan, but never in Castilian Spanish. But equally, it was theatre was often done in Catalan. So this wasn't something that happened overnight, but it was something that was very much orchestrated from regional government by different government institutions.
Thank you so much. Someone else is asking let's say you support Franco, would you say that Franco did a good job having the viewpoint of a Franquista?
Well, that's a kind of circular question, because it's, if you're a Franquista, you're going to think that Franco did a good job. I guess the argument is, well, I mean, I was just chatting with earlier today, because our book's been selling less than we expected in the US, but better than we expected in Spain. And one of our worrying explanations is that it could be the fact that the front cover could be encouraging Francoists to buy it. I guess the argument that a defender of Franco would always say, they've got their two arguments is, their argument would be, you know, Spain in 1975 was a much richer country than Spain, a much richer, more prosperous, more European country than in 1939. I guess my counter argument to that would be, yes, that's true, but I expect that's more despite rather than because of Franco. And actually, Franco got lucky. Franco got very lucky on a couple of things. Where did he get lucky? He got lucky with the fact that mass tourism hit up in Europe, and that made Spain a lot richer. And he also got lucky with the Cold War, because it allowed him to reinvent himself as an anti-communist and have a certain to have a certain degree of respectability on the international scene. So I would say, I don't think you can justify Franco because of all the, you know, all the killings, all the deaths that happened, all the repression. But even if you were willing to accept those in the name of progress, I'd say the progress that was made was largely, although not exclusively, a matter of luck.
Someone has asked, what was your personal view on the October 2017 Catalan independence referendum?
My personal view in what sense? In whether it should have happened?
They just said personal view.
So my personal view, I mean, I've got a longer, my personal view is it was a mistake for it to be held. It shouldn't have been held. But the response of the Spanish state was unjustifiable. If they want to have a look at I did a longer piece which basically explores my ideas over about 1,500 words, which I wrote at the time. If they look up in the Duncan Wheeler in the London Review of Books, they'll find a longer kind of personal piece on my opinions of the different issues involved and the arguments for and against.
Another person is asking, why has Andalusia as a region not been as keen to demand independence?
Right. There's a lot of there's lots of explanations, but I'd say that I'd focus it on two. I'd focus in on one in the sense that it's, I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to economics. So, and I think this is one of the things that when people say, when people often talk, you know, did a lot on the BBC. I did a few things for the BBC radio when the whole Catalan thing was happening. And one of the things they often would make the comparisons with would be Scotland, the Scottish independence movement. And I'd say, yes, but no, because I'd say one of the big differences is within the UK, that Wales, Scotland are amongst economically, whether they should be or not is a different matter, but they're amongst the poorest elements of areas of the United Kingdom. Whilst in Spain, Catalan and the Basque country are amongst the richest. So I think that's one important question, one important issue. So if Galicia isn't as strong either, there's a sense in which they feel that economically it might not be tenable. I think then there's as historically they feel, because so many of there was an independence movements, if you go back to the early 20th century with Blas Infante, but I think also because so many of the images of Andalusia, to say bullfight, birth of bullfighting, flamenco, have been taken up as part of the Spanish imaginary. Actually, they identify, often more people in Andalusia identify with the national Spanish project than people in Catalonia and the Basque country often do. And actually, if you saw after the Catalan referendum, well, last time I was in Seville, the number of Spanish flags in windows and balconies was huge. And that was basically a reaffirmation of a sense of belonging to the Spanish community. So I think it's the economics and not feeling excluded.
Sorry, I'm just looking for another question. Um, how are Galician nationalists advancing Galician culture?
So that's another a very good question. I mean, I think one of the challenges for Galician nationalists has been the fact that, unlike the it's actually traditionally quite conservative with both a small c and large c area. For a long time, for Pepe, the right wing, who are fierce nationalists, Spanish nationalists, have been in power there. So actually, Manuel Fraga, who was Franco's right-hand man, actually reinvented himself as a democratic politician and was president de la Junta de Santiago de Galicia. I think what's very strong in Galicia is, I wouldn't want to minimize Galician nationalism, but a lot of it is to do with high culture. It's been very good at, kind of lots of literature, lots of subventions, lots of subsidies for work for Galician poets, for Galician plays, Galician theatre, but that doesn't necessarily meet the demands of the kind of interests of everyday people. And actually, there's a further complication with Galicia, which so many of people from Galicia have. It's traditionally, largely because of its poverty, it's been a place of emigration. And I think a lot of the kind of popular Galician culture can be subsumed into this idea of the folkloric. So the image of the bagpipes we saw. So my conclusion would be, they're doing a lot in terms of vindicating culture written in Galician. They're doing valuable labor there, but I doubt it will translate into a major political movement.
Thank you. And so this is going to be our final question, and it's, how can Spain be perceived as a diverse country by Spaniards?
So by diverse, I mean, it's a difficult word to use, diverse. I guess I'm going to use the word, I guess I'd say pluralistic. And here I'm going to actually go back to one of my big arguments I have in the book. And one of the big arguments I have in the book is that actually one of the problems with current day Spanish democracy is the fact that Spain has, it's got democratic institutions. In so many ways, it's a different country to 1975, but it's inherited a kind of a dictatorial stance of, and you see this if you see debates in Parliament in Spain, of you're either with me or you're against me. And I think that one of the big problems that we have in Spain at the moment is the fact that people kind of recognize, people like the diversity when it comes to a kind of, on a superficial level. They like if they go to, a different area of Spain, they can have different specialities, they can have food, they can try different food. Spaniards travel a lot within Spain. If you go to a parador of the state hotels, they always have local dishes. The problem is when it comes to recognizing that people having different cultures, different tastes, may mean they might have different opinions, different priorities. And I think, we've got coronavirus doors. The state has got these coronavirus to deal with at the moment. But I think, over the next 5 years, it's going to be fine. It's going to be the task of recognizing diversity and plurality is going to be the same as a challenging task. But if that's not done, then protecting the democratic institutions of the nation state are going to be even more complicated than they have been. So I think I will leave it there. But what I will say is I think my email is d.wheeler@leeds.ac.uk. If anyone wants to contact me to ask any questions, maybe there wasn't time for their questions or I didn't want to ask it in a public forum, then I'm more than happy to speak to people on that one-to-one basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone so much for joining. Thank you to Queen's College, Professor Wheeler, at the SSLP, and everyone for coming and asking so many questions. We're so sorry we couldn't answer all of them. There is another Thinking About next week called The Accidental Activist at 5 o'clock. So if you would like to join that, feel free. Thank you so much.
Thank you.